So, we're going through the book of Luke, and I have to tell you, even though this is the story that we are landing on, I was going back and forth about whether or not to toss this out and talk about something else. I actually had several drafts of this, and I've made some headway and some future messages. But I came back to this because it's important to me. It's important to me that we have some knowledge of what our individual accounts of Jesus are trying to say. And part of the reason that's important to me is because they don't all line up neatly, despite what so many of us have been told. And there's invitations in these texts, sometimes where the differences appear, sometimes where the similarities do. And I also came back to this text because it's setting up some important foundation for the future. It's a building block story. Okay? Luke, the person that we call Luke, we don't really know this author's name, is trying to make a point to us so that we pay attention for future stories and teachings we're going to read. And I also came back to this because we've got a very interesting depiction of Jesus here. He's kind of mischievous. He's a little rascally. You know? We have a Jesus who grows, who learns. And this is despite what I was taught growing up. That Jesus knows everything, knew everything, has the knowledge of everything, and therefore we can rest content that we also know everything if we just follow Christian tradition and Christian teachings as imparted to us by our conservative tradition teachers. Right? So we got to talk about this. We've got to talk about this very weird story. Also, you know what? It's a little bit fun. It's a kind of fun story. Now, this is the only account of Jesus, only story of Jesus in the Gospels as a boy. And by a boy, I mean like beyond the newborn or toddler phase, where Jesus is not just like the subject, but also the object. Jesus is affecting the world around him at this point, right? This isn't the only story of Jesus as a child that we have in Christian tradition. We have some non-canonical gospels. That means these were like stories of the life of Jesus that didn't make the cut. That also have interesting stories of Jesus. Now, they're fun to read, but I'll point out that while they were popular, they didn't make the cut because they were not so popular as to insist on being included. And they also made some claims that were like very much in keeping with like the Gnostic conversation of the day, like a lot of these competing ideas. And they have some absurd depictions, which are fantastic to read, but maybe so fantastic that you couldn't really like lay the claim of historicity into it. Even people 2,000 years ago were like, that's silly. Nope, that's a silly thing. But I want to share a couple of these. Jean-Dominique Croissant, who's a biblical scholar, says that this Jesus is much more like Dennis the Menace than any Jesus who like may come to our mind today. So in one account, Jesus makes these beautiful clay sculptures of pigeons and throws them up in the air, and you know what? They come to life. Yeah. That's kind of a cute story, right? There's also another story, I believe this one's in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus gets really mad at a playmate, smites them dead, as, you know, children do, and then resuscitates the child. Now, there's a point the author's making. The Gospel of Thomas is making the point that even as a kid, Jesus has power over life and death. Maybe not a lot of self-control, but power, which is a terrifying idea. Like, that's a horror movie, isn't it? A child with the power over life and death. Yeah, right? So we've got this story, and it's a bit more tame in comparison. But it's doing a job for our text. I mentioned it's a building block. Well, this building block is telling us, hey, Jesus is a smarty, and you should listen to him. And how does our author do this? Well, he taps into this trope that comes up in the biographies of the day. So Rita read one of them. Josephus, author of Antiquities of the Jews and a number of other things, he's a Jewish writer and historian who wrote after he was captured in the war between Israel, or Judea, and Rome. So I've mentioned many, many times there was a war. Jerusalem was devastated. 70 AD, the temple's destroyed. Josephus was a participant, a leader in that war. And in exchange for not dying, he wrote a story of this, a history of this. And people liked that, and they wanted him to keep writing. Hey, can you give us a history of your people? And so he writes about Moses. And in the story of Moses, he says a lot of things. Moses was the most handsome of all babies. People would look at this baby and they would, I'm not kidding you, they would have to glance back. They couldn't believe it. They had to go give the baby a second look, because how on earth could such a beautiful baby exist? And Moses was very smart. The teachers of the Egyptian court were so happy to teach Moses because he was brilliant. And this also carries on in stories of Caesar Augustus. He was also a prodigy. We should all do what the Caesar says because we all know they're divine, they're a demigod, they're related to Jupiter, and also they're smart. Caesar Augustus, he was a smart kid. And Epicurus. So if you're a foodie in the room, you may have heard this term, Epicureanism. There's often a partnership drawn there. But Epicurus was a philosopher who is said to have studied at the feet of other teachers at the age of 12, the age of Jesus in this text. And he started his teaching career at the age of 32, near the beginning of the age traditionally ascribed to Jesus, starting his ministry. Now, that's the literary reason this story's in here. And that's all great. But I'm going to tell the story, and then I want to share a nugget for us, even in today's topsy-turvy world. So in our story, in case you've never heard it before, maybe Rita's reading was the first time, and you're still like, okay, Giuseppe's saying this is an entertaining story, prove it. Every year, Luke says that Jesus, Joseph, and Mary go on a trip with other folks from their town to Jerusalem. This would be a caravan type situation. They all load up together and they go for a walk, a really long multi-day walk. They get to Jerusalem for Passover, and this is a week-long celebration. People are feasting, they're hanging out, they're probably catching up, There's enough distance between everybody that you're going to want to make the most of this trip. And then Passover ends, and they hit the roads. And we are one day into the trip back. And Joseph and Mary look around, and you know what they realize? I can't find Jesus. This is a parent's nightmare. This is the kind of thing that still keeps me up at night. So Brio turned 7 today. It's very exciting. For 7 years, this has been a nightmare for me, that I would misplace my child's, you know? Anybody else, any other folks in this room know what I'm talking about? Like, yeah. Or you have that situation, you're doing like the trip, you know, you stop at the bathroom and then you're like, oh no. We were at the airport this summer, and Brio he was really distracted by this toy he had in his hands, and I look over, and there he's followed a totally different family. And I'm like, it's happening, no! So, you know, I titled this sermon Home Alone, Lost in the Temple, because it gave me some Home Alone, Lost in New York vibes. It wasn't all that long ago that I watched it, because Christmas time. Right. So they're one day into this trip, which means they return. They do like a full day of going back to Jerusalem. I know they're probably going through like all the worst case scenarios, right? Then they're in Jerusalem. And they are tracing their steps, right? And it takes them 3 days. 3 days to find Jesus. And where is he? He's in the temple. What has he been doing this whole time? Where has he slept? What has he eaten? Luke does not care to give us any of these details. He's not worried about that. And then, understandably, Mary screams at Jesus, "Why have you done this to us?" And Jesus gives a response that I'm pretty sure that 12-year-old Giuseppe would not have been able to articulate. He says, well, you should have known I would be in my Father's house. Really? They should have known? They should have just known you're going to be in your Father's house? Cool. Also, how does Joseph feel about that? You know, I know he's like adopted dad in this story, but still, come on now. And yet Mary treasures this in her heart. Sometimes that's how it goes. You do something rascally, and for some reason, your parents like, hey, that was messed up, but it was kind of awesome. That wouldn't have been my response. That's Mary's response. So I already got into, like, Jesus is depicted in this story as, like, sitting as a student, and the teachers are amazed by him. And so one of our takeaways is supposed to be, like, look how smart he is. And we're also supposed to take away from this, like, he's in continuity. He's in continuity with Jewish tradition because he's asking questions and he's giving answers. And even the teachers in the temple are amazed. And that's all great. But then Luke says a couple of things that caused me to pause. One of them, that Jesus went on and he didn't disobey his parents, which implies to me that Luke knows that Jesus was being a little disobedient. Like, if our writer feels the need to say, and Jesus wasn't disobedient to his parents going forward, it kind of sounds like he's saying, maybe he didn't 100% honor his father and mother like the Torah says he's supposed to. I'm not saying you have to believe that, but I'm putting it out there. What an interesting thing for Luke to feel like he needs to say. This came up in our Connect group a few weeks ago. We were talking about the question, like, hey, did Jesus ever make mistakes? Did Jesus ever sin? This came up, and so did the time that Jesus called a Gentile woman a dog. The interesting thing about both scenarios is our writers depict a Jesus who makes a course correction. Now, maybe Jesus is just modeling the course correction for everybody else. And Jesus is sinless and never made a mistake, and it's totally like that could be the case. Or maybe Jesus did make a mistake. Maybe Jesus is human enough to make a mistake. I'm not going to negotiate that for you. Deal with it how you will. But the next thing Luke says is that Jesus grew in stature. So he grew bodily, he grew physically, and he grew in wisdom. Jesus grew in wisdom, which means Jesus didn't know everything, which means Jesus learned. Can we make room in our perspectives for a Jesus who doesn't always know everything, who learns during his earthly ministry? Can we make room for that? And this is where I find an invitation for us. This last week, we saw supremacy of all kinds assert itself in power. White supremacy, hetero-cis supremacy, colonial supremacy, U.S. supremacy, on, and on. And one of the aspects of Christian supremacy is this unquestioning notion that we know everything we need to know. We know it all. We know all that matters. When I was a conservative youth pastor, I reiterated the same things that I was taught in Bible college and that my youth pastor taught, and I did my own share of damage with this. I would carry the Bible up and I would say, in really hokey, early aughts youth pastor lingo, do you know what the Bible stands for? Basic instructions before leaving Earth. I remember preaching one time, there are people out there who are looking to solve the mysteries of the universe, and here we've got all the answers. And yet, the more I study the Bible, like seriously study the Bible, listen to scholars and historians and archaeologists, the more I find out, actually, we've got a lot to learn. And that's actually pretty good news. I am convinced that if we seek to pursue the world that Jesus taught so often about, the world that God desires, a world where equity and inclusion, where people are not forgotten, where the marginalized are instead centered, if we seek to live in that world, at least amongst ourselves and our neighbors, we have to be willing to admit we don't know everything, to learn, and to grow. And if we can't do that, we are arrogant, and we are guilty of our own form of supremacism. So that's my word of invitation. That's the nugget. That is what kept pulling me back to this story. 12-year-old rascally Jesus, who gives a very profound and yet somewhat snarky response to his mom, and then models that we too can and ought to grow in wisdom and in years. Thank you for letting me get that off my chest.